Welcome, everybody. Those of you who have just joined us in our post-AGM euphoria. This is our meeting number 79, it says, although it's only the 78th of reasons which are beyond us. We've got three very interesting papers, two of which were given at the AFS annual meeting last year, and one which was planned for that but didn't quite make it. So we're still in the AFS mode, as it were, as we will be in March as well. The three in March will also be AFS ones. The next meeting will be March the 8th, and then after that we'll continue with these Zoom meetings, but we haven't yet set a date. And if you want to know our other things coming up, like the Broadside Day, Spring Conference in April, one in October in Leeds on traditional song in northern England, please go to the website to check out all the details there. And of course, we have our Broadside Day next Saturday in Sheffield. So again, check out the website if you haven't already got that in your calendar. So, kicking off, we have three papers today. We're going to start with Michael because he was here first, and then we'll go to Anna, if that's okay with Anna, and then we'll go to Julia. Normally, our speakers sign on early and we have a little practice beforehand, but because of the AGM this time, we haven't been able to do that. So just keep your fingers crossed that everything works as well as it ever does. What can possibly go wrong? Michael, you're on first. You're going to be talking about child's taste.
Yes,
Yeah.
such as it was. Okay, I'll be reading because this was a reading paper for AFS. The title is "To Put the World in Possession of All the English Ballads, Francis James Child, Taste and the Aesthetics of Popular Balladry." Even the most generous of folksong scholars would agree that Francis James Child failed in his ambition to, quote, "put the world in possession of all the English ballads," close quote, in his monumental English and Scottish popular ballads. Indeed, from Thelma James's assertion in 1933 that, quote, "a child ballad means little more than one collected and approved by Professor Child," to Stephen Winnick's recent claims that Child, quote, "used his gut feelings to decide which ballads were popular and then applied his own sense of propriety to censor them, so that, quote, no other scholar's decisions would have been identical to his. The profession has pronounced his life's work intuitive, implicit, and idiosyncratic." My intention today is to debate that very particular consensus. I will not argue that Child cataloged the popular ballad corpus completely, that his method of selection was correct, or that his approach should be practiced today. My approach is historical and not theoretical. I will argue that Child's process of compiling his collections, and it is important to remember that there were two, was the consequence of what we would call today his aesthetics, but which during his career he might, if asked, have called the application of the universal standard of taste, which he was taught and which he for 45 years taught to Harvard's students. Specifically, I will show that Child's use of this standard was an essential step forward in the development of an American definition of the ballad, which dominated the field of ballad studies from 1860 until World War II. I will argue that Child's method was formally empirical in its logic of discovery, formally conjectural in its justification of its discoveries, and a posteriori in its judgment of the value of those discoveries. That is, that it was a consciously formed Baconian process of scientific inquiry that began with the collection of a broad corpus of data capable of supporting a series of explanatory conjectures, themselves capable of producing reasoned consequences, themselves capable of being justified by the confidence they created in those who heard or read them. Had I world enough and time, I would demonstrate in greater detail that Child's approach to the popular ballad was steeped in an Anglo-American aesthetic tradition that traces itself from Joseph Addison to Lord Kaimes and Shaftesbury, to David Hume to Edmund Burke, to Thomas Reid and Hugh Bear, to Douglas Stewart, to Sir William Hamilton, to Harvard, where President James Walker and Professor Edward Channing taught this Anglo-Scots catechism to their students, Francis Bowen, Child, William Wells Newell, Charles Saunders Peirce, William James, and who in turn instructed George Lyman Kittredge, Francis Barton Cumry, Phillips Barry, John A. Lomax, and finally Gordon Hall Giroud. In a shameless plug, I encourage those who might be interested in that history to purchase my forthcoming book, The Only True Folk Songs in English, American Ballad Scholarship, 1855 to 1915. Absent that, let me instead recite a few doctrinal matters concerning Child's theory and method. First, Child's database of ballads was a closed account. He believed that the popular ballad was an uncatalogued historical genre with medieval roots. Indeed, he had contemplated building a fence around that catalog since his first undergraduate discussions with William Ellery Sedgwick, his college roommate in the 1840s. Child believed further that it was now impossible to create popular ballads, and where they still persisted, they were both being erased and diminished by the rise of the printed broadside and the culture of reading. Second, he despaired that his initial collection in the 1860s were hurried, unsatisfying, and driven by his publisher, Little Brown's desire to sell books, a fact he bemoaned in an 1860 letter to Ellery and again to Sven Grundtvig in 1872. We know too in great detail, thanks to Walter Morris Hart and Miss James, the steps he took to rectify his mistakes in his second collection, making over 200 additions, subtractions, and substitutions. Finally, we can identify the progress of his attempts over 40 years to obtain copies of all the known available sources, including funding the publication of the original manuscript of Percy's Relics with £500, $13,000 of Harvard's money. Underlying these facts were several common sense first principles. First, the genus of poetry was divisible into two and only two types, the poetry of the people and the poetry of art, each identifiable by certain features and neither identifiable except in contrast to the other. For Child, neither popular ballads nor art poems were self-evidently distinct. The two poetries existed in a permanent genetic and historical symbiosis, at once divided from and dependent on the other for its definition. In general, Child acknowledged several gross distinctions. Popular ballads were oral, medieval, and displayed an absence of subjectivity and authorship. Art poems were written, passing from their writer's pen to the public's eyes well prior to their entry into oral tradition, if they ever did enter, and even when their authors sought to disguise their origins. Subjectivity for Child could run, but it could not hide. In practice, Child's selection process proceeded by the logic of via negativa, based on the corollary that it was easier to identify art poems than it was to identify popular ballads. This fact, however, did not mean that the hand of the versifier was an automatic disqualification. Some texts, particularly broadsides, deserved a second and third look, even inclusion if any remnants of the people's voice could be discerned. Once he had winnowed his data, Child further separated wheat from chaff by a process of close examination in which, instead of searching for the needle in the haystack, he simply threw away as much hay as he could. Once the ballad haystack was reduced, he subjected the remaining texts to what Joseph Addison identified as the exercise of true relish. Addison, who recorded that phrase in 1711 in his Pleasures of the Imagination, argued that for, quote, someone to form a right judgment of a description, they should be born with a good imagination and must have well weighed the force and energy that lie in the several words of a language, so as to be able to distinguish which are most significant and expressive of their proper ideas, and what additional strength and beauty they are capable of receiving from conjunction with others. The fancy must be warm to retain the print of those images it has received from outward objects, and the judgment discerning to know what expressions in them are most proper to clothe and adorn them to best advantage. In child's hands, the right judgment of true relish could be achieved by careful application of philology, a discipline he had already used to teach the world to pronounce Chaucer and Gower, and thus to read the Canterbury Tales for the first time in 500 years, by analyzing the metrical value of Chaucer's final E. True relish, however, was only the first step. To perfect the process, one had to turn to David Hume, whose essay, The Standard of Taste, added the idea that the turning of true relish into discerning judgments required the intervention of a true judge who possessed, quote, a strong sense, united to delicate sentiment acquired over long involvement with the sentiments produced by a class of objects at hand, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice, can alone entitle critics to this very valuable character, and the joint verdict of such that wherever they are found, the true standard of taste and beauty resides. Note that the conclusions produced by the conjunction of relish and judgment were and are provisional, probable, and only confirmable by the demonstration of a larger consensus that was immediately, quote, immediately discernible to every man of ripe understanding who had a distinct comprehension of the premises and conclusion and who compared them together. Note, too, that the enemies of discernment, as they would be for the Romantics and the German idealists, were the very fancy and imagination that made all forms of poetry possible. Fancy in this Anglo-British tradition was always impulsive, always took flight, as Addison wrote. Imagination's task was to calm fancy's intense reactions by checking its responses with more restrained creations. Faces in the clouds, fanciful beings, picaresque characters, Homer's Greek heroes, and an occasional Stan Lee Marvel comic star. In contrast to the refined discernment of true judges, the ordinary taste of the, quote, so-called vulgar was dominated by, quote, the first influence of general rules upon the mind. Such rules were, quote, rashly formed in hopes of showing the quickening of fancy, and in the slowing the quickening of fancy. And in the absence of further reflection, vulgar reasoning, according to the Scottish realists, was moved by prejudice instead of wisdom. The wise, in contrast, as Thomas Reid noted, took care to survey the broadest possible range of experience, allowing, quote, a second influence of general rules to supplant the first. In this manner, the capricious and uncertain ideas of the vulgar gave way to, quote, the more general and authentic operations of understanding. The wise prevailed, of course, because they had time and resources to join the philosophers at the tea table, where their views could be examined, compared with others, read against, shared history, and above all, refined through contact with ever more consensual, dispassionate judgments. Moreover, the rhetorical approach Child learned, taught, and practiced argued that individuals of the right temperament could be trained to examine, quote, the great variations of taste among individuals, and to discover what made possible, quote, the wide agreement in judgments of taste about certain works of art and artists. In this sense, the each to his own vagaries of chacun à son goût became for Child not just personal whim, but a practice of provisional learning, whose value could be as precise as any other reasoned observation. Let me quickly demonstrate the play of these principles by discussing Child's infamous rejection of Peter Buchan and his ballads. Child acknowledged to Grundtvig in several letters that there was much in Buchan that was genuine and unaltered, a point he affirmed by including 36 texts in his second collection that he had excluded in 1858-59. But he persisted in identifying Buchan as a, quote, unscrupulous falsifier. His problem was the dreaded presence of subjectivity, exacerbated by what he thought was a collector's mortal sin. Poets might work to make old ballads more perfect. Collectors were bound by the ethics of the true judge. But internal evidence, he wrote, demonstrated, quote, the extraordinary, and notice the choice of the word, vulgarity, especially of many of Buchan's ballads. And this, quote, obvious vulgarity, I would argue a formal aesthetic criteria, led him to conclude that, quote, Buchan must have tampered with his originals even if he did not invent them out and out. Grundtvig cautioned Child not to be too harsh with Buchan. Quote, the vulgarity of Buchan's texts, he said, is the best good proof of their material authenticity. According to Grundtvig, and that of, quote, the other ballad collectors of the Old World, where the conditions of bygone days still linger on, the old ballad cannot always appear in a stately and knightly form and apparel, but must in many instances exhibit the traces of long dwelling in humble company. For Grundtvig, vulgarity was the natural state of, quote, the country people, and hence, quote, very often what now to delicate ears may seem vulgar is the fact of the old stamp, retaining the features and phrases of the higher classes in the Middle Ages. For chivalry in reality was by no means too refined and sentimental, no means so refined and sentimental as it appears in modern romance. Child acknowledged Grundtvig's points, but he stood his ground. The popular voice must not be presented if embellished by poets, collectors, or broadside writers. Quote, I must give you one proof that Buchan was a cheat. Relating a story from another correspondent, he explained that John Hill Burton had sent Buchan a fragment of the ballad Childe Ether, which, quote, was drafted by a friend at his bedside while he was recovering from an illness, in order to take the measure of Buchan's honesty. And he continued that despite knowing this, Buchan still included the text in his collection. Quote, Peter was so happy as to be able to supply all that was missing from the recollections of the peasantry. I had reason to believe in Buchan's dishonesty, as Child wrote, but, continuing, I wanted explicit proof. The ballad in question almost anyone would pronounce as a forgery, but I still put it into my own collection with only the general caveat in the preface. It will be hard to sift Buchan's rubbish. Despite his certainty, Child wrestled over and over with the pressing questions of what to do with Buchan's rubbish. He acknowledged that he was deeply skeptical. Quote, my conviction, he wrote, is, quote, that Buchan was determined to have a version of his own of all the more important Scottish ballads, and that his process was, as Sheridan says of plagiarists, to disfigure them, as gypsies do stolen children, to make them pass as their own. This invocation of plagiarism, disfigured children, and gypsies is telling evidence of Child's taste. Disfigured stolen children is certainly an over-the-top metaphor, but in Child's hands, it defines Buchan as a culture thief whose ambition led him to foist himself upon traditional fragments and to selflessly display an, quote, artificial vulgarity, which makes me fear that it comes from a man and not from a class of people. Asking pointedly, quote, how is it that Kinloch's ballads, which were also gathered in the north of Scotland and which are given without the slightest editorial inference, show nothing of the kind? Child summed his considered judgments by listing the moral failures that Buchan's ballads displayed. The vulgarity consists in a tame, mean, unreal style expression, far from volksmässig. I do not find this in any other ballads. At issue in his struggle over which text to include was the obvious presence in his eyes of the collector poet's ego, even in the best of broadsides. True scholars valued honest expression of collective taste, even when that taste was poorly exercised or almost wholly absent. Hence Child's praise of Kinloch, who showed his versions rather than choosing from among them, or manipulating all of them to achieve an unnatural perfection. Excuse me. To Child's mind, versifiers like Buchan sought to display by always editing their texts to supply bigger, longer, fuller, better versions, definite signs to Child, again, of Buchan's ego interfering with the natural process of oral traditional creation. Importantly for Child, the problem was not print, but self-promotion. Child's idealized popular ballads represented the cumulative we of a class of people. Buchan, he felt, was symptomatic of every collector who put his individuality ahead of scholarly interest in preserving popular tradition, as did another example, William Motherwell, who Child wrote to Grundtvig later on, remarking, "Didn't he do the same with Sir Roland? Was he not his own ingenious friend?" Buchan's inability to check his personality at the door further confirmed for Child that the truly popular had to be affirmed by an empirically grounded, dispassionately applied standard of taste. Writing to Grundtvig at the beginning of their correspondence in 1872, he affirmed even in stronger language the distinction he had made 13 years earlier in English and Scottish ballads. Ballads were recognizable first as a consequence of source and second as a matter of moral distinction. He, that is Child, acknowledged three ballads, those found in manuscripts such as, quote, the Robin Hood ballads. They were the oldest and often the best. Those that were especially historical and composed in comparative recent times, found in the mouths of the people. And finally, the, quote, immense collections of broadsides, Roxburgh and Pepys, specifically, some of which were definitely popular, and yet on the whole, and again notice an aesthetic concept, were veritable dunghills in which only after a great deal of sickening grubbing, one finds a moderate jewel. Simply put, Child's attack on Buchan memorialized his acceptance of the theory of taste, memorialized itself most fully in David Hume's most famous quote. The same Homer who pleased at Athens and Rome 2,000 years ago is still admired at Paris, at London. All the change of climate, government, religion, and language have not been able to obscure his glory. And second, in the caustic, again Hume, whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogilvy and Milton or Bunyan and Addison would be thought to defend it no less an extravagance than if he had maintained a molehill was as high as Tenerife or a pond as extensive as the ocean. Though there may be found persons who give preference to the former authors, no one pays attention to such taste, and we pronounce without scruple the sentiment of these pretended critics to be absurd and ridiculous. To which should be added that Edward Channing, Child's mentor at Harvard, reinforced this position with his own declaration that, quote, beauty and sublimity are not things of custom, fashion, or unstable opinion. That verse and prose, the epic drama and ode are not arbitrary devices of this man to suit himself, but they are the natural methods to answering of some want in collective affection. Thus, when Child's critics argue against his choices, they are picking the wrong fight with the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Child's criteria and practice were not quirky or eccentric. They were, by the time he began his work, the cutting edge of Harvard's professorial class, all of whom believed that their task was to train their students to become the best true judges they could be. Consider, again, the words of Child's mentor, Edward Channing. A considerable proportion of standard works in literature are strictly popular and equally favorites with all classes of readers. These are national epics, national songs. They are plays, fables, and novels which have once and forever taken possession of the hearts and memories of the barbarian, the slave, the undereducated, of every man who could read or hear them. This is what Child taught for 25 years when he taught rhetoric, when he heard recitations on Whately's logic and Campbell's rhetoric. When he replaced Channing, he argued from the same common sense approach that popular ballads could be, quote, instinctively perceived and felt by the common nature of men. For Child, the power to determine the beauty of crudeness of any ballad or broadside was not a matter of prejudice or fancy, but as Channing had taught him, the product, quote, of a never varying truth and excellence. And when it was such, then it was scientific. Nobody who understood it questions it because it bears the evidence of its own good. Let me close with two final versions of this American ballad science. The first penned by George Lyman Kittredge in 1898, and the second a decade later by George Gerould in his 1908 discussion of the ballad The Bitterwithy. First, Kittredge, describing Child's work. Mere learning will not guide an editor. What is needed in addition is a complete understanding of the popular genius, a sympathetic recognition of the traits and characteristics that characterize oral literature wherever and in whatever degree they exist. This faculty, which even the folk has not retained, and which collectors living in ballad singing and tale-telling times have often failed to acquire, was vouchsafed by nature herself to this sedentary scholar. In reality, a kind of instinct, it had been so cultivated by long and loving study of the traditional literature of all nations that it had become wonderfully swift in its operation and almost infallible. A forged or a retouched piece could not deceive him for a moment. He detected the slightest jar in the genuine ballad tone. And the second by Gummery, which became a standard for the Harvard-trained academic folklorists searching for American ballads. The test by which the traditional ballad must be judged, I take it, are three. The first is purely personal, the critic sense of the scholar who has learned by long, continued, and careful study to distinguish the false from the true, to separate the chaff from the wheat. The second is the external evidence with reference to the circumstances of discovery, whether the collectors or collectors be trusted. The third is the source of the material, whether the narrative is the product of tradition or of some clever invention. Such American Toryism may be woefully out of touch today. Certainly, its standards far more elitist and snobbish than we would tolerate. But Child's competency to exercise those standards was not. His people and their ballads were, he believed, historical evidence of the popular culture of the Middle Ages. Their poetry was unself-conscious and impersonal because their culture, balanced as he understood it between the ancient and the modern, had not yet developed a language with which to transform the mind and heart of the people into the poet's musings. For Child, the class of the people who made ballads could be documented empirically without any appeal to Herderian national pasts, Taylorian evolutionary talent ladders, or Kantian transcendental idealism. One simply had to learn to exercise refined taste and dispassionate judgment on the actually available transnational traditional songs and ballads of Western Europe. And if one did, one found that genuine popular traditional ballads were waiting patiently to be discovered in the possession of the continuing remnants of the people as a whole. Thank you. I'm sorry I started to dry mouth on you.
Thank you, Michael.
Welcome.
We have
Yes,
we got 5 minutes still. If anybody wants to raise a hand, you know how to do it. Go down to
Tina's up.
react down at the bottom. Anybody got a hand up? Tell me again, Michael, your book that you got coming out.
It's called The Only True Folk Songs in English, which is a direct quote from James Russell Lowell from an 1855 lecture he gave in Boston as part of what was known as the Lowell Lecture Series. And he was he was doing the history of English literature in 12 lectures, and the fourth lecture was the ballad. I have written about that in an article on James Russell Lowell, which is published in the Journal of American Folk. Quite a bit of this is from articles that I previously published, as it often is the case. So, and then it does Lowell, Child, William Wells Newell, the ballad, the games and songs fame, um, Francis Barton Gummery, and then the Great War between Gummery and Newell, and ends with John Lomax. Begins and ends with John Lomax. In 1912, you may not believe it, but in his presidential address to the American Folklore Society, John A. Lomax actually said, "There are no American ballads. We can only have ballads by courtesy in America," was his phrase.
Right. One of the Nobody's got their hand up? No?
As far as I can tell, I've silenced everyone. I'm so
Yeah, well,
sorry.
we are gobsmacked. No, it's the kind of paper where we have to think about it and read it. One of the things you said right near the beginning about um, child erecting a fence, I think is the phrase you
Yes.
used, around the ballad. And I'm not so sure about that because reading his letters, he was unsure about various ballads. I mean, some were obviously in, some were
Right.
obviously out, but there were quite a
Absolutely.
few that
And he
were,
tended to err on the side of putting in rather than leaving out.
yeah, yeah.
But
So
okay,
he's
the phrase comes again from his correspondence with his friend Ellery Sedgwick, in which he literally says that his dream is to put a fence around some portion of English, unfenced English literature. And so, from his first hiring at Harvard until the completion of his collection, he started out by searching for a piece of a kind of English literature he could do that with. And he first fixed on Chaucer, hence his famous work on how to pronounce Chaucer. But of that, he said, it will never work. The English have the manuscripts, and no matter what I discover, they will always find something more or something else. So he then turned to Spenser, and he did a 6-volume edition of Spenser, which sold very well in the States and got good reviews. But when he finished when he finished the Spenser, he wrote to Ellery and said, "Little Brown has now said I can produce a collection of ballads." And after that, he never looked back.
But isn't it true that any scholar tries to draw a fence round what they're interested in because otherwise they just go on forever? You do have to map your territory and you have to have borders, however porous.
Yes, but I'm treating it as ambition, not a fact.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so I mean, I think it is important to see some of these ambitions for the historical facts they are. I mean, if you think at one level about Child's claims, he made some pretty big ones, didn't he, Steve? I mean,
Yeah.
the 1882 to 98 collection announces that he's gotten all the English ballads into one collection, except for a few. I mean, for all of the modesty and hiddenness we always pretend, at least in the United States, about Child, he really was this quiet, I mean, that's a pretty big thing that's a pretty big sentence to write and publish. That's a claim, and that certainly was a claim that the folklorists in America who came after him set out to defend. I
Yeah.
mean, the American focus on the child ballad was an attempt to say we had got it all, so that we had defined the genre. Um, we were just as good as English scholars.
Well, of course you were. Yes. Okay, we've got to move on. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
That
Don't
was
tell
very
that to the
thoughtful.
English critics who kept saying we couldn't produce anything.
Right, we must move on.
Yes.
Anna, you're up next. Anna, we're not changing the subject entirely, but changing the field that we're talking about. Anna's going to be talking about Portuguese collection in Lisbon.
Yes.
Yes. Would you like to start, Anna? Would you want to
Oh,
share your screen?
yes. Can I share with a moment, please? I may share. I'm sorry. I can't find. Oh dear. I'm sorry, I cannot find.
It should be down the
Oh,
bottom.
yes, I think, yes.
Yeah, that's
I
good.
think, okay. Can you see?
We can see it, but yeah, that's good. But you got
That's good. I'm going to put it bigger.
Yeah,
Yes.
you need to start your presentation.
Yes, I'm sorry for the delay. Well, my thanks to Steve, by the way, for the invitation, and my greetings to all of you. The aim of this paper that I'm going to read is to show that the Portuguese digital archive of oral traditional literature is or can be more than a simple storage of documents, and it may be a useful tool for the studies of oral traditions. I will begin with a general introduction about the path traveled from orality to paper and from paper to digital before moving on to the circumstances of the creation of this archive. Well, I recall that for centuries, the knowledge, most of the knowledge, was transmitted orally from generation to generation, especially within illiterate communities. The main contexts of transmission were family, community works, festivities, um, and places like fairs and pilgrimage, where cultural exchanges were usual. Regarding the transmission of oral literature, for instance, we must not forget the blind man who traveled around the country selling chapbooks, broadside ballads, and leaflets with songs that they used to sing to attract customers. As the years passed by, many practices began to vanish from their natural context. The reason for this, among others, were the mechanization of agriculture, the massive emigration here in Portugal, the advent of television and other new forms of entertainment, and even the transformations in family structure. In addition, the new generations began to associate traditional knowledge with poverty and to depreciate and abandon ancient practices. On the other hand, there was very little contact between academics and rural communities, and with remarkable exceptions, folklore was not valued by scholars. As a result, for a long time, the collection and edition of oral literature was scarce, although we must not forget the great publishing activity of romances or Hispanic ballads in the 16th century, many of them written by cultivated authors. In the following centuries, the enthusiasm of the upper classes on romances declines until the advent of Romanticism, when the academic interest of the academics on this subject began to have a bigger expression. In fact, it can be said that until the 19th century, ballads remain alive only in the memory of the people, at least in Iberian Peninsula. I felt it was important at this point to draw attention to those from whom the vanishing of oral traditions and its safeguarding was a major concern. It was important, to give you an example, of the Portuguese scholar Leite de Vasconcelos, who, when traveling around the country on his research work, realized that many practices were disappearing and issued the warning, let us attend to everything while there is still time. This was in 1933. Another example is UNESCO that make recommendations to establish national archives where collected folklore can be properly stored and made available. Sorry. However, the truth is that the procedures to achieve these recommendations are not simple. One of the reasons is that we are not dealing with fixed texts, as in writing, but with texts that memorized and transmitted orally from generation to generation, traveling through time and space. During this process, they undergo the phenomenon of variation of many versions of the same song, ballad, or tale are produced. These facts complicate the procedures for safeguarding the collected texts. In fact, the path traveled from orality to paper and from paper to digital are long and complex, especially when you consider how the means of collecting, transcribing, classifying, archiving, and publishing have changed over the years. You can see here some examples. On the left side of this slide, on top, is Almeida Garrett, the pioneer of publishing romances, the Pan-Hispanic ballads in Portugal in 1851. He got these traditional ballads not directly from field work, but from his own childhood memories and through friends, and used to arrange or embellish the ballads with the best lines of the several versions he managed to obtain. Next, here, we see Vasconcelos, who used to collect directly from the people and take notes on any piece of paper. He practiced however, he practiced the utmost rigor in the transcription of the collected texts. Years later, the collections were already made with sound recording equipment, which became very useful because they avoid the slowness of writings as listening and allowed to check the transcriptions whenever necessary. In Portugal, the first systematic survey of popular music was done in 1939 and 40, but the advent of lighter devices, recorders, in the 50s and 60s made the field work easier, as you can see by these photos of some renowned Portuguese collectors like Michel Giacometti and Guerreiro that you certainly don't know. But then increasingly modern means of recording and the images began to be used. On the right, you can see some of these old recording devices and tapes, two transcriptions of oral texts, the first to paper, one handwritten and one typed, and some old files belong to my research center. And here the image of a computer that represents the present digital archive. Well, now I will present the digital archive of traditional oral music, literature that we call ADLOT, beginning with a reference to the circumstances and origins of its creation. In 1993, following in his previous works over decades, the professor Viegas Guerreiro created the Portuguese Popular Tradition Center in the University of Lisbon. This center became the repository of thousands of compositions of traditional literature in all genres: ballads, songs, folk tales, legends, prayers, nursery rhymes, riddles, and so on. They were collected from orality since the 50s of the 20th century in different regions of Portugal by researchers and students connected in some way to the universities. These collections, which include sound recordings and paper transcriptions, are divided into two main groups: the historical archive, composed by two sets of collections, those made until the 70s, and those made by groups of students who were doing something that we don't know. It was the civic service created in 1975 after the Carnation Revolution. Maybe you heard about this in Portugal. And they were waiting to enroll their first year of the university. The other group of the collections we have there was named the new collections. These were made from the 70s by undergraduate, masters, and even PhD students under the guidance of Professor Pinto Correia. Well, Both collections were kept in different kinds of storage, like wood and metal file cabinets, boxes, and folders, as we saw in previous slide. However, their cataloging was not complete and was not enough efficient. Besides, due to the fragility of paper files and old tapes, there was the risk that collections would deteriorate with manipulation or to be lost. The situation was making difficult to consult the documents, especially for researchers, foreign researchers who attended the center. So, at a certain point, it became clear that the necessity to find efficient alternatives to safeguard this heritage and make it available. And soon, the center realized the advantages of using digital for solving problems while maintaining the same scientific requirements. The first project, born in 1995, was called Technotrad, meaning technology plus tradition. It covered about 12,000 compositions from the historical archive and remained available on internet until the beginnings of the millennium, when it ceased to be accessible due to technical issues. In 2002, now under the coordination of the new director, Professor Pinto Correia, the team of the time, of which I was already a part, began to explore possibilities to create a new digital archive dedicated to the new collections. In addition to safeguarding the registers and make them available online, we wanted to create a database with new features and make it a dynamic tool for the studies of traditional literature. That was not an easy task, and there was many problems to solve. One of them was to select among the huge number of compositions that were in the center, which should be included in this archive. The choice fell upon the years from 2002 to 2007, with the hope that the remaining years could be added later. The other difficulty to solve was the structure of the database itself, that we had to ask to a firm to create, since it would accommodate the compositions in a complex classification grid created by the coordination of especially for traditional oral literature. When this database, when there was another kind of classification, either than being a tale or a song or something else, we used to include the international identifications, such as the IGR for Pan-Hispanic Ballads and ATU, Arne Thompson and Uter for folk tales. These were also included. Another problem we had was definition of some subgenres, such as prayers, formulas or spells, which does not meet still yet consensus among experts. These efforts resulted in development of the project ADLOT, which was approved and funded by the Foundation for Science and Technology, the Portuguese government entity responsible for funding and evaluating the scientific system. In 2013, ADLOT was available in internet with around 13,000 compositions and worked without any problems for a few years. Well, on the right of the slide, we can see the opening page of the first version of the archive of the ADLOT, and below an example of how records appear to the public. Each entry contained the composition, its classification, the date and place of recording, informant's data like the name, age, birth, place of birth, occupation, qualifications, and also the name of the collectors and other informations considered relevant. The searches in the database could and still are be performed using various parameters, namely those I just mentioned, and had fields for help and for relevant articles, including criteria used and also for bibliography. This project was complex and foresaw the needs of a second stage, which ended up happening later. On the left side, we can see a summary about Adlot, which I mentioned. Unfortunately, after a few years, the platform was becoming obsolete and creating operational problems, which led to interruptions in online access to Adlot. Additionally, by 2018, we had to deal with the passing away of our coordinator and with changes in the university regulations, which affected its our formal functioning of the center. Moreover, as a research line, we had less financial autonomy. By 2020, as everybody, we faced the problems caused by COVID, the pandemic problem, such as the university closing doors. We could not go there. Happily, we could communicate online, and during this period, the team decided to carry on a lot and began to prepare the second edition. The first steps were to replace the old platform with an updated one, with a new design and a revision of some features and get a new hosting for the database. Then we managed to migrate the data from the first edition of Adlot to the present one, except for the maps. In 2023 and 24, the second edition was already online, although there are still some adjustments to be done. In the right, you can see in the front page and below an example of a register as it appears now. In this case, it's a version of a ballad collected in 1975. This is the ballad called Gerinaldo, which is known since the 16th century and is still now sang seldom, but it is. The team also began to insert old audio files, which we had found forgotten in some dryers. It was a miracle. I would like to show you a version, but I don't know if I can here or if I have the time. Well, presently we are working in the gradual inclusion of the remaining collections of the center as initially planned, and are making some experiments as the hosting of external collections. This seems to be going pretty well. Well, the team is already, for finishing, the team is already thinking of the future of the future of Adlot with the restoring of some features that the second edition doesn't have, such as the geolocation of each collection, the expansion of a new cycle of collections, which is useful to evaluate the state of tradition. And we want to get transcriptions of audio records by a system of voice recognition, which is not easy. And we are doing experiments with artificial intelligence and to create an automatic pre-classification system. Now, to conclude, we hope that this archive may contribute to the studies of oral traditions and folklore and to the safeguard of intangible cultural heritage, as well as a way of empowering those whose voices are often silenced or forgotten, meaning the people from where we are getting these ballads, these tales, these legends that are still known. Thank you very much for your attention, and forgive me for the bad English.
Thank you, Anna. That was very good English, actually. It was better than my Portuguese, certainly.
Okay, I'm going to leave this. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. That was fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we do have time for some questions if anybody wants to raise a hand. Could I ask you, Anna, about the voice recognition?
The voice recognition is very hard. We tried, and the problem is the accent of people, because it recognizes the pattern Portuguese, if it is close, but it does not recognize the way of speaking of the people. For instance, in the islands, in Azores and Madeira, they have a very strong accent that sometimes even as have difficulty to understand. So it is very, very difficult to use this, but it helps because it recognizes a few words, and then we manually do the rest.
So this is automatic transcription.
Yes, it
of,
was
of
yes,
the text, right? Yes.
It would be good because it would save us lots of work, and we have few people working now in this area, because unfortunately the oral traditional literature disappeared from almost all universities as I don't know, as a discipline, as a
Right.
yes. And there are no students, and so we are. It is very difficult to get new people to work on this.
So nobody else has asked a question. So is your funding secure? Is it government funding? Or?
Yes, very secure. Well, this fund, the FCT, is the entity that funds almost every scientific projects, and this one ended. This one for the first edition it already ended, but we are now in this moment. We are because they don't open it every year to all to everybody. Sometimes they give more attention to science, and sometimes humanities get forget. But we are trying to make a new project. We are doing filling the forms to present a new
the application.
Yes, a new application. Yes.
Yeah. So Catherine has her hand up. Catherine.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Anna Maria. Actually, I was at your paper originally at the American Folklore Society, but there's so much in it. It's very dense, and you've got lots of visuals and everything, so it was worth seeing again. I'm just wondering, could you share maybe in the chat the web address? I did actually look it up at the time, but if you could share it, it would be really helpful, because it's kind of thing to dip into sometimes.
I'm going to try to do that. I don't know, in the chat, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. Elaine has put it there.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Adlot.pt.
That's
yes.
easy.
Okay. Adlot.pt. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, it's well worth having a look up at that, ladies and
but
gentlemen.
I can write it again. Okay.
No, it's good. That's fine.
It's good. Oh,
thank you.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you, Anna Maria. That was
thank you
excellent.
for your attention and your patience.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. So we move on to our third paper. Julia, I can't see you. Where are you, Julia?
I'm here. There's so many
You're
people
there.
here. It's really nice.
Julia's going to talk to us about Child again, and the carpenter, James Madison Carpenter, who came a little bit after Child.
Just a bit, yes.
Yeah.
But Michael's very kindly set the scene a bit for me. So I think we're back at Harvard, basically. So let me just share my screen. I don't remember how to do this. It might be this one. Let's try it.
Right, yes, that's there.
I just need to, oops, do this.
You need to start your slideshow.
Yeah, sorry, it was being. Is that okay? Can you see all right? Is
Yeah,
that big
that's
enough?
perfect. Yeah, that's good.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm the one who didn't quite make it into the AFS for some reason. So, but it's really great to have this opportunity to talk a bit more about Carpenter, the Carpenter collection, and the relationships at Harvard. So I'm going to read this partly because I know that if I extemporize, I'll probably not stay to time. So we're going to look at the influence of Harvard on the creation of the James Madison Carpenter collection. And just in case there are people here who don't know much about the background to the Carpenter collection, I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap to start off with. So in 1920, 32-year-old James Madison Carpenter, on the left here, an erstwhile minister and school principal from Mississippi, he entered Harvard to undertake graduate studies in the English department. Supervised by George Lyman Kittredge on the right, the renowned English scholar and successor to Francis James Childs, Carpenter went on to complete a doctoral thesis on shanties and sea songs, and he got his doctorate in 1929. So with funding awards from Harvard and Kittredge's support, Carpenter made 2 collecting trips to Britain in 1928 and then again in 1929 to 35. During this time, and to a lesser extent afterwards when he was back in the US, he amassed a wealth of traditional song, including ballads of the child canon, which he ultimately intended to publish as British and American traditional ballads with tunes, which volume he claimed would be, and I quote, the most valuable collection of child ballads with tunes ever published, and would form, quote, an invaluable supplement to Child's English and Scottish popular ballads. As we now know, this aspiration was never to be fulfilled, and Carpenter's vast collection remains unpublished, although it has now been digitised and is available via the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library. Carpenter himself disappeared from the folklore and folksong scene in America in the 1940s. So I've written a couple of articles about this sort of thing before and Carpenter's biography, and today I'm going to revisit that earlier research together with and drawing on documents that I looked at since. I've been to the Harvard University archives a while ago, and I also went to Carpenter's hometown in Mississippi while his niece was still living, and she gave me quite a lot of his personal effects and papers. So I'm going to draw on some of those. But my sort of aim here is to try and unpick a bit more closely the ways in which Carpenter's work and his ambitions developed in relationship to the legacy of Childs and Kittredge at Harvard, particularly in relation, of course, to the ballads in his collection. So it's worth remembering, I think, straight away that Carpenter didn't come to Britain to collect ballads. He'd come to undertake more research into the sea shanties and build on his 1928 visit and his doctoral thesis. And he says as much in his application. But it wasn't long after arriving in Britain that in 1929, that he encountered his first ballad in Dundee. And he found that locating ballad singers was much easier than finding retired seafarers. A few months later, in early 1930, he came across his outstanding contributor, Belle Duncan, whose extensive repertoire comprised many ballads, all of which she could sing, and some of them were quite rare or even unique. Carpenter clearly told Kittredge, I beg your pardon, about these discoveries, and Kittredge got him another year of funding. At this point, the object of Carpenter's work had been broadened then in the remit of this grant to shanties, ballads, and popular songs, as we can see on this slide in the letter from Kittredge to Carpenter. Nevertheless, as Kittredge comments, quote, "We are much interested in your collections. Don't drop the shanties, however, in favour of the child ballads. Collect whatever seems to you worth collecting. But remember that the texts of the child ballads are pretty well known." Now, this comment really reflects Kittredge's position as the one who completed, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, publication of the final volume of Child's English and Scottish popular ballads, and the one who went on to consolidate Child's legacy through his teaching and supervision at Harvard. Kittredge regarded Child's work as having established the canon and identified the corpus of text which constituted it, the genuine ballads of the people, that Child had been able to find as definitive. We know from hindsight that the remark didn't discourage Carpenter from collecting ballads. However, it does highlight the question that Carpenter's ballad collecting faced. If Child's British textual corpus was already regarded as largely complete, albeit largely garnered from manuscripts and printed sources, what additional kinds of evidence could Carpenter's fieldwork in Britain offer, and what might be the critical significance of that evidence? So by looking at the development of his methods and his writings over the course of his career, I hope to show how he came to frame his ballad collection as more than an accumulation of further texts, though it has to be said he was very fond of rehearsing the statistics relating to the texts and tunes in his collection. But he did try and make it a sort of theoretically significant supplement to Child's. He would do this through the inclusion of the ballad melodies, his emphasis on performance, and the use of fieldwork to try and address 19th century literary debates around authenticity. In doing so, he remained largely faithful to the legacy of Child, and particularly his mentor, Kittredge, while also extending, or perhaps from his perspective, enhancing it in certain ways. So the records at Harvard indicate that, contrary to what we might assume, Carpenter hadn't taken the English and Scottish popular ballad course taught by every other year by Kittredge before he came to Britain. But he clearly had some knowledge of it, because he cites the one-volume edition of Helen Childe Sargent and Kittredge, the 1904 edition of Child's, in his Carpenter's PhD thesis bibliography, which you can see on the left there. So, as is well known, that introduction conceptualizes ballads as ancient, orally transmitted, but largely extinct in oral tradition now, and therefore only recoverable through textual comparison of manuscript and printed versions. Carpenter's early letters from the field suggest he was already grappling with this issue, the settled nature of the Child canon, and what he was encountering in the field. Responding to Kittredge's earlier letter that you saw, Carpenter speaks in terms of adding, quote, considerably to the store of knowledge of ballad literature, and that he's encountering versions that are, quote, as vigorous and of as high merit as any that I have seen. By the end of 1930, he reported to Dean Moore at Harvard that he has, quote, a mass of information that will throw unusual light on the future study of ballad literature. What's striking here is that Carpenter goes beyond the statistics of what he's accumulating and is beginning to make claims around the potential of his material to illuminate ballad scholarship. A key figure in this process was the singer Belle Duncan. Carpenter stresses the authority and authenticity of her repertoire to Kittredge in a 1931 letter. He compares her with Mrs. Brown of Falkland, stressing that she was a farm servant, this is Belle Duncan, of course, who has, quote, the inherited belief that her version is the version, and that all others, if there should be others, are wrong. He highlights the quality of her ballads, quote, she has too not the flimsy ornate idiom of conscious mediocrity trying to produce verse, but the straightforward, sometimes uncouth, but always strong and seemingly inevitable idiom of the peasant ballad singer. She sang all her ballads, of course, hence she has the singer's and not the writer's or even the reciter's idiom, according to Carpenter. Thus, he seems very sure of her importance as, quote, unquestionably the most important ballad singer in the history of recorded ballads, because most of her versions have come down to her via oral tradition, and many of her versions are, quote, distinct from any so far published. He also singled out ballads of other singers as well, and put a similar kind of gloss on those too. Now, intriguingly, he also asked her, quote, numberless questions concerning buckens, kinlocks, herds, purses, and Child's collections. So Belle Duncan was not only an exceptional singer, her repertoire and her insights could be used as a corrective to book-based ballad scholarship. He wanted her opinions on these things. The same impulse is evident in Carpenter's field research relating to the collections of Dean Christie and Peter Buchan. Again, as you've highlighted them earlier on, Michael, the sort of the ones that there was some controversies around or some question. So in another letter of 1931, Carpenter this is, talks about going back to Dean Christie's territory. He says, where he found in Dean Christie's territory a man whose mother had given Christie some songs. He recorded them for me, says Carpenter, together with a dozen others. He knew the, quote, crazy man who gave Christie the Duke of Gordon's daughters. This is, you won't be able to see it, it's too small, but it's noted there in the footnote at the bottom. I found a fair number of songs from Dean Christie's territory and shall try to get a few others, says Carpenter. I told you my plan to make a quick check of Dean Christie's territory. I don't blame him now so much for cribbing. By 1932, this approach to following up on controversies in ballad scholarship in the field has extended to Peter Buchan, whose district he had also been collecting in with painstaking care, as Carpenter put it. He says, I believe that I shall have something constructive to offer in connection with many of the mooted points relative to his collection. And so he says, the more or less hazy objective with which I began this research has sharpened into a clearly defined purpose, that of discovering the truth concerning current traditional literature. The unprecedented breadth of range and bulk of my collection, supplemented by the collections of others, should form a dependable basis for sound conclusions. Later we learn that he sought Belle Duncan's opinion of Buchan's ballads and other people's. One singer said she had no recognition of Buchan's ballads, and according to Carpenter, Belle Duncan's keen eyes twinkled. Her shoulders shook in a silent chuckle. Then she said, I dinna ken that sort of ballads. Another strand of Carpenter's rationale relates to the ballad tunes. In a 1931 letter again to Kittredge, he highlights the fact that they have been collected, quote, with tunes scientifically accurate, many of them recorded for the first time, and again insists that they will be of inestimable value in the future study of ballad literature. That this is partly thanks to Kittredge is somewhat surprising, given that in Kittredge's introduction to the 1904 edition of Childs, he begins by stating, as I'm sure you all know, a ballad is a song that tells a story, or to take the other point of view, a story told in song. More formally, it may be defined as a short narrative poem adapted for singing. Yet, Carpenter had come to Britain armed with a dictaphone cylinder machine, which Kittredge had personally acquired for him just prior to the 1929 collecting trip. This is envisioned, the dictaphone that is, as assisting in collecting the tunes of sea songs, which Kittredge again had also insisted were essential for inclusion in Carpenter's PhD thesis. Carpenter, of course, found the opportunity to use it to record ballad melodies from performance in Britain, a scenario probably not anticipated by Kittredge. Thus the dictaphone became central to Carpenter's emerging justification for ballad collecting. It enabled him to document a melody systematically, and thus to claim that his work addressed a dimension of ballad tradition largely absent from Child's text-centred corpus. Sorry, I meant to show you that slide when I was talking about the dictaphone. There it is.
Wow.
Okay, so by the time Carpenter returned to Harvard in 1935, after 6 years of collecting, his collection was extensive. Foremost amongst his materials numerically, of course, as you could predict, were the ballads. And we can see this from this 1938 publicity leaflet he had printed advertising his illustrated lectures. If you look beneath his portrait and short biography, you'll see the extent of his collection from Britain set forth. 500 versions of sea shanties, 700 versions of popular ballads, 300 versions of folk plays, and so on and so forth. Clearly, the numbers of ballads surpasses any other genre or group of genres that he's collected. The brochure also shows that he's planning to publish these ballads under the title deliberately echoing Child's work, English and Scottish Traditional Ballads. In trying to raise still more funding to support his work on the transcription of the tunes and editing his ballad texts, which was his priority at this point, Carpenter brought together the themes emergent in his fieldwork and articulated them more explicitly and coherently. It was also, and again, this is sort of a bit of a surprise, but it was also at this time that he took Kittredge's ballad course. His own notes and those of Harvard colleagues, I found them amongst his personal effects when I visited his niece. So you can see on the left there, he's got a note to check his colleague, who is Sam Bayard's notes on it. And I don't know if you can see that, but these are his own notes on the right-hand side here. And this is from September 1935 on Kittredge's lectures. So they're quite interesting, actually. So let's see. He was hanging on every word, obviously, of Kittredge's. And in this way, I think it sort of gave him a bit of confidence to attempt to frame his work for external assessment and external audiences and crystallize his thinking into a bit more of an explicit theoretical position. So we find these in his sort of grant applications and outlines of his work at the time. One of these was one he put together for a bid to the Guggenheim Foundation for a fellowship in 1936. His plans for work begin. The collection will have a definite place among folklore collections as a supplementary volume to the authoritative work English and Scottish Popular Ballads by F.C. Child. The Child collection was chiefly selected from books. My prospective publication is from tradition. With the exception of 40-odd ballad tunes in the supplement, the Child collection has the texts of the ballads only. My publication will have both texts and tunes. It should be noted that my collection of ballad tunes, the largest ever made by one person, is the first to be scientifically recorded by means of dictaphone records. So we can see he's sort of deferential to Child. He wouldn't dare sort of vie to be the ballad collection. So he frames it as a supplement, justifying this through statistics, but also through the sense of performance and the collecting of the tunes. He emphasizes the song ballad, units of text and tune that are preserved and shaped by oral tradition. He explains to the Guggenheim Foundation assessors why he singled out these supposedly ancient ballads instead of collecting everything like previous collectors had done. He says, I adopted such a course because I early realized that the song ballad holds a unique place in literature, in that is almost a perfect embodiment of the essentials of poetry and music. The versions I took down from British tradition were still in the process of being varied or moulded by British folk, who had usually inherited the ballads from a long line of tradition, and who, in ringing their personal changes, wrought as to the manner born. Thus, my British versions, varying from earlier printed texts either widely or slightly, have in a great many instances at least preserved the ballad in its unspoiled traditional form. So this selectivity gives Carpenter the capacity to say that he was able to classify ballads well. By this, he means ascertaining their respective places as to traditional authenticity, or assessing their relative or intrinsic merit, which he sees as the crux of all editing. There's sort of a bit of a second child there, but with using his orally collected materials as a yardstick. He also makes great play of the fact that he classifies his tunes by the mode, and he points out that many of them come from the Scottish Highlands or the vicinity. I'm not quite sure what he means by that. And so are marked by the modal characteristics, which he relates, gives them a sort of ancient character. So this then is ultimately Carpenter's response to Kittredge's point that we started out with. He accepts that the texts of the Child ballads, at least as found in Britain, are well known, but he argues that his ballad collection functions as a supplement by bringing together texts and tunes, introducing evaluative comparative evidence from the field, and this evidence can assist in testing earlier editorial interventions against living tradition. Carpenter becomes a bit more forthright about this later on. I've been able to date this document to the 1940s or 50s. This would have been after Kittredge died. And he's a little bit more forthright, saying, Child thought he compiled the whole extant mass of ballad lore, and Professor Kittredge says so in the preface to his short tradition published in 1904. And Kittredge had already said, with the exception of 4 or 5, no ballads were sung anymore. He's obviously brought amassed all this evidence to the contrary. He made similar claims in the early 70s when he was just about to sell his collection to the Library of Congress. In one of his documents to Alan Jabor at the Library of Congress, he says that the tunes, it supplies these tunes in comparison with the paucity of tunes in Child's collection. And he has this lovely phrase that the use of the collection will be as a plumb bob to the traditional authenticity of Child's material and to prior publications in an age that thought nothing of arranging tunes, editing texts, and divorcing ballad verse from its tune. So a plumb bob is like an early spirit level. So across 4 decades then, Carpenter's position was quite stable. He didn't seek to reconceptualize the child Kittredge model, but to complete it, using methods and material not previously brought to bear on ballad tradition. Of course, though, his collection was never published. That may reflect his personal circumstances, his loss of institutional and personal support. As I mentioned, the death of Kittredge, who was really his mentor and who swung him so much money. He says in one document he thinks he had about $14,000 over the years from Harvard to make this collection and to work on it afterwards. But also he remained loyal to a theoretical framework which was perhaps beginning to wane at this time. Nevertheless, he does anticipate later interest in melody and sung performance. So we could say his collection is not a sort of failure in that sense. We could say it's not only a direct product of the training and patronage he got from Harvard, it's also an attempt to answer the question implicit in Kittredge's comment, how to make new scholarly claims about a corpus whose texts were already thought to be complete. Thank you, everybody. I will stop sharing and see you all again, hopefully.
Sorry, wasn't ready. Yes, well done. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Wonderful, as always. Excellent.
Thank you.
Really interesting. We've got time for some questions, people. Anybody got any hands up yet? Can I ask you, Julia, about the his views on Peter Buchan? Because, you know, Buchan has his detractors and he has supporters. Where did Carpenter himself stand in the end? You know, did he think that Buchan was a good thing or a bad thing?
The latter, yeah. This is, you know, when he checked it out with Belle Duncan and she says, I dinna ken that sort of ballads, you know, he took that as a kind of way of confirming what his mentors, Child and Kittredge, and, you know, in the lineage was Sharp with Childs had, you know, already come to the conclusion. This was despite the fact that he would have read Keith's assessment of Buchan. But Carpenter, he definitely felt that he had evidence to the contrary, you know, that Buchan was not a good thing.
Right. Yes, I thought too. Tina's got a hand up first before, although Michael, do you want to speak to that point before Tina?
No, I have a different question.
Oh, okay. So Tina's got a hand up first.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really interesting. And I love the picture of that lady as well. You know, it's just wonderful. Can you put up, there was a written comment on the letter on one of the early slides. So, sorry, I'm making you work here, Julia. If you can put...
Can I go back? Yeah, let me just have a look at it.
Put it back and see if I can find it.
Was it Kittredge's letter to Carpenter? Sorry, shall I share again? Is that
I think
okay?
if you share, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, okay. Oh,
Don't
you're
worry,
really trusting me here. Okay. Well, it's good practice. Here we go. That's been successful. Let me put it on full screen. It's a bit easier to see. Sorry, let me go back. I'll make you feel seasick now. Was it this one?
Yeah. Please. Yeah, it's just at the very, very bottom. I'm sending this copy to General
Post Office at Aberdeen.
In case you are still there. But I love the comment next. It says, please don't go getting sick again from overwork or any other cause. And I just thought that was just so delightful. It's just like, you know, a little addendum. It's just, you know, and that.
Well, actually, yeah, absolutely. But something is really interesting. That note, and I've only ever just noticed this now, is not from Kittredge. It's from his daughter, Dora.
Dora.
And there's several references to Dora. I don't know if there was anything going on there, but I don't think so. But yeah, he definitely knew her, Carpenter, because students at Harvard used to go around, the graduate students, to Kittredge's house in the second half of their course, and they had to do presentations, and apparently he smoked cigars sort of endlessly and would offer these around to students, some of whom unsuspectingly sort of took them and weren't quite used to smoking them. Carpenter being one of them, he apologizes in a letter for smoking the wrong end or something like that. So, but I guess, yeah, that's maybe how he got to know Kittredge's family. That wasn't unusual to Carpenter. I think he did that with his students throughout, from what I've read.
I suppose as long as it was tobacco he was smoking, but you know.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Michael was waving.
Julia, very quickly, did Carpenter have any connection to Kittredge's other famous students, particularly to Phillips Barry? It would have seemed that they were on exactly the same page. Is there some communication between the two of them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there is. He's one I mean, he was sort of there with a lot of luminaries, really.
Right, yes.
Although he was away in the early 30s, obviously, when quite a few of them were going through. But you can see, obviously, he was a contemporary of Sam Bayard from one of the slides. But he did have contact with Phillips Barry, who was very encouraging. And Phillips Barry wrote him a reference for that Guggenheim application that he made. And he wrote a very full and praising letter of Carpenter's field work and the importance of his work with the music. And I think he sort of finishes.
That would have totally appealed to Barry. That was from the purely earlier American. That is the contribution that Barry makes relative to Belden and to Pound, neither of whom put the music in. Barry wouldn't do anything without. He's the one that said it has to be music and song together in 1904, the same year Kittredge published the collection.
Yes, it's really interesting. And I think we can say that Carpenter had sort of come to that conclusion independently, but obviously it gave them something in common. And they would have agreed about, I think they had other differences, but certainly that, and I would love to go through if the Barry collection is available anywhere, his papers. Oh, okay. I've been looking for them, but I can't find them.
If you find them, please call. I have we'll be in there together. I promise you. I have not been able to find them anywhere.
We really do need that time machine. We got 3 questions, so we're going to have to speed up a bit. So John's next. Okay. Speed up, John.
It's just there seems to be the early collectors had quite an elitist idea about what to our eyes about what folk music is, and I wondered if Carpenter, he seems to be influenced by more modern ideas, liberal ideas, less elitist ideas, because you emphasised, Julia, that he asked Belle Duncan for her opinion, and so I just wondered what was. He came from the Harvard tradition, which seems to be very much a sort of F.R. Leavis's English novel within, a canon of ballads. Did he show any other signs of moving away from that elitist model? Because certainly by the 1940s, there were people talking about these songs in a less elitist way. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's my question.
Yes, I'm not totally sure I'm sufficiently up in, all of that. I mean, I would say that Carpenter's a bit different, I would say, to many of the people who were at Harvard, because he came from the Deep South, as of course John Lomax had done quite a few years before him. So he was really quite different, and I think there was a sense where he didn't ever fit in with anywhere in his life. He was always a fish out of water, even when he went back home to Mississippi, because he'd become quite sort of, bookish, I suppose, or he was quite bookish, and that was what took him to Harvard. But I'm not sure. I think about his selectivity with the ballads, and he just seems to have a different type of elitism maybe than some of the British collectors. Yeah, I'm not totally sure I'm going to be able to answer your question. Sorry, I feel like I need to think about that a little bit.
But there may not be an answer.
Yeah. Can we move on to Margaret? Margaret has a hand up.
Yes. Did Kittredge sing? Was he a singer himself? Did he sing ballads?
I don't think he did. I've never come across that in any of the reading, though I haven't read every last thing about him. But I do know he played the piano, and Carpenter sang his ballads. Yeah, he liked.
Did Carpenter sing? Did he sing? Yes. Did he share songs with it? Yes, I sort of saw it. connection there. Hamish Henderson, of course, great singer, and I don't think Hamish Henderson would agree with either comment on either Keith. He thought that Alexander Keith wrote a premature obituary in a book. That was it. And yes, he thought it was, it was like an obituary, the last leaf
totally,
hung on. The other thing was that Hamish's big question about Wachen was, did they ever sit inside a farmhouse in the northeast and listen to singers? They didn't. They were shocked by anything. It wasn't parlour, and there was a lot of Wachen that wasn't parlour. Therefore, we get slated on all sides. But I think that maybe we should. It's not in my repertoire, or yours maybe. But that's what they sang.
Yes, I just can't believe that Carpenter sat in obviously in a farmhouse in the northeast and listened to lots of singing, and he still came out on the wrong
giveaway
side.
For the farmhouse. I don't think he still was in a different class in a certain extent.
Yeah. Sorry, last question from Catherine.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm
just wondering, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
What's the accessibility of the collection now, Julia, of Carpenter's collection? It's none of it digitized or anything, is it?
Yeah, it's been digitized, and it is now available. The actual sort of raw collection, if you like, is available via the Vaughan Williams. I'm indebted to a whole slew of people, some of whom came before me and worked on the collection, then a whole team of lovely colleagues who worked with me on the collection and recreated the metadata for it. That was then converted, I think, largely with the help of Elaine, who's here today, to it be ingested into the Vaughan Williams digital archive. I think there might be a few problems with, because it's quite a complex collection and there's quite a lot of metadata, but you can, And we also have a catalogue of it on the Digital Humanities Institute website of the University of Sheffield, but it's not linked to the digital images, but it's a bit cleaner, that interface. So some people search there and then they go to the Vaughan Williams to find the pages they know they need.
Okay, I might talk more about it on Broadside Day to you.
Yes, of course.
Give you a lesson.
Right.
Thank you.
Definitely the last question. Simon.
Right. I'm of course, when we're talking about the music, the obvious person who needs to be brought into this discussion surely is Bronson. If you look at the references in Volume 4, then to James Madison Carpenter, there are only 2 references, and those references are very brief, and almost brusque, as much as say, where the hell is all this stuff? I don't know was there any connection between the 2 of them? Did they communicate? And would you like to comment on?
Yes, thanks for your question, Simon. Yeah, they did communicate, and I think they might have overlapped a bit at Harvard, because Bronson was another one who went through.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we've lost Julia.
Julia's frozen.
Julia's gone.
Correspondence, but I do know that there's correspondence with other people like Margaret Dean Smith, I think, at the Vaughan Williams, sort of talking about the fact he could never get the stuff out of Carpenter, basically, because Carpenter was incredibly possessive about his collection, because he still harboured that hope that he might publish it one day, and he knew he probably had the only one of a handful of tunes for certain ballads. But then, of course, he never did, so it's never made an impact, and it's still there in its raw state. Although I've been transcribing and listening to the cylinders, and I hope one day I'll be able to make those public, my own transcriptions of the cylinders, because Carpenter wasn't musically trained. And in another paper I did at the Collectomania conference, I was talking about how his transcriptions of music they're good, but they're not absolutely accurate as they could be, in my opinion.
Oh, thanks.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all 3 of our speakers today. Excellent lineup. It was really good, very interesting. And we'll be back again on March the 8th. So if we don't see you at the Broadside Day at the end of, on Saturday, then I hope we'll see you on Zoom in March. So thanks for coming.